Welcome to the Gaming Co-op Take the Point. My name is Eric, aka Sparklophobia, and today I'm going to be sharing with you my top recommended starter deck for each class. These decks use only commons and rares, and their core strategies are based on cards from the classic set or cards released in 2017, meaning that you can still keep playing them for more than a year. The first deck I want to show you guys today is Midrange, aka Tempo Warrior. This deck basically revolves around filling the board with small creature and using deal 1 damage or deal 1 damage to all creature effects in order to trade up and establish board control in the early game. Once you establish board control, you play out like a mid-range deck, playing out a single large threat each turn beginning on turn 4 and going into the later game. Once you've run out of cards, you can use Acolyte combined with Whirlwind effects, as well as Battle Rage combined with Whirlwind effects in order to refill your hand and keep up pressure into the late game. Ideally, you want to try to end the game by turn 8 or 9, but all the draw effects allow you to go significantly later. The main change that you can make if you have the dust is to swap out one Argent Commander for Grommash Hellscream, which can be fantastic for closing out games, especially against control decks. The next deck I'd like to showcase is Midrange or Token Shaman. This deck is similar to the Warrior deck, in that it revolves around using a combination of cheap minions as well as cheap removal in order to establish early board control. However, there are some key differences between this deck and the Warrior deck. The first is that rather than focusing on deal 1 damage and 1 damage Whirlwind effects, this deck focuses on cards that create additional bodies. The Jade cards, Primal Fin Totem, Firefly, and Feral Spirits are all cards that can create additional bodies on board, which you can then use in combination with Bloodlust and Flametongue Totem in order to close out the game. Similar to the Warrior deck, this deck can win by simply playing large creatures back to back and using those to pressure the opponent. However, this deck is much stronger against control decks because of its ability to burst out the opponent. The main difference in matchups is that this deck is really strong against control decks and a little bit weaker against aggro decks. If you'd like to improve this deck by spending dust, I would suggest crafting Aya and Patches in place of Jade Spirits, and replacing the Argent Squires with Bloodsail Corsairs. That will increase the consistency and strength of your deck. Next up is Hybrid Rogue. Just like the last two decks that we looked at, this deck is all about establishing early board control with a combination of cheap minions and cheap removal, then curving into a powerful late game. The main difference with this deck lies in its mid-game. This deck has a very powerful set of 3-drops which can quickly turn a small early game lead into total mid-game dominance. This deck has no particularly bad matchups, but it's very dependent on drawing a good mana curve, because it lacks the card draw and giant burst to win a game without it. If you have the extra dust to spare, you can improve this deck by replacing Argent Squires and Galaka Crawlers with Patches, 2 Bloodsail Corsairs, and Edwin Van Cleef. After Rogue, we have Midrange Paladin. While this deck has strong early minions, it lacks early removal. Instead, it uses tools like Eldor Peacekeeper, Fallen Sun Cleric, and Blessing of Kings, as well as mid-game weapons to keep its minions alive and make as favorable of trades as possible. By focusing on favorable trading, you can grind out a board advantage that you can turn into a win using your late-game minions, threats drawn from Stonehill Defender, and cards drawn from Divine Favor. This deck is especially strong against other mid-range decks and control decks, but struggles to catch up after falling behind, making it weak against aggro and tempo decks. The best way to spend your dust is to swap out Argent Commanders for Tyrian Forging and Sunkeeper Tarim. Midrange Hunter is next up on the list. This deck is possibly the strongest of all the starter decks, since it has the least number of differences from versions of the deck that players have used to hit high legend. This deck has almost no removal and doesn't much need it, as it has one of the most consistent and powerful early games around. The game plan for this deck is simple. Play the best cards on curve and take favorable trades until you whittle your opponent down low enough to finish them off with Kill Command, Unleash the Hounds, and your hero power. Most matchups are very favorable, with the only notable exception being Tempo Rogue. There aren't many improvements that you can make by spending dust, but you can spend gold and swap Knife Juggler for Kindly Grandmother from the second wing of One Night in Karazhan. After that is Token Druid, one of the harder starter decks to master. This is a tempo deck. Unlike decks that we've looked at before, this deck doesn't care too much about dominating the board early and will usually focus on removing just enough to survive while ramping up its maximum mana with Wild Growth and Mire Keeper. Once you have enough mana, you want to combine Spreading Plague, Violet Teacher, and Grim Necromancer with Mark of the Lotus or Power of the Wild to generate a large threatening board. After that, you can close out the game with a combination of board buffs and Savage Roar to burst down the opponent. This deck can sometimes struggle against control and combo decks if they are able to draw enough board clears, and it can also be vulnerable to weak draws. As for substitutions, you can round out the deck by replacing Grim Necromancers with Living Mana, and 1 Spreading Plague and 1 Feral Rage with Fandral Staghelm and 1 Ultimate Infestation. Now let's look at an old classic, Zoo Warlock. This deck has been around since the early stages of Hearthstone, and it largely owes its permanence to powerful, overstatted 1-drops. This deck has the highest average statted early game in the game, and looks to take advantage of that fact. Like the Paladin deck, this deck uses minions to buff one another to take value trades and grind out a board advantage, then uses powerful late game minions to close out the game. This deck can struggle against tempo and combo decks, but is strong against aggro, mid-range, and control. If you find yourself facing a lot of control decks, try swapping Drain Soul for Cobalt Scalebane. If you have the resources, run Malchezaar's Imps in place of Argent Squires, and replace Possessed Villager and Dark Iron Dwarfs with Despicable Dreadlords and Bloodreaver Gul'dan. Next up we have another tempo deck, Secrets Mage. This deck is much more forgiving of mistakes than the Druid deck due to its powerful early and mid-game plays and its tremendous amount of burn. It uses the combination of Mana Worm and Sorcerer's Apprentice with cheap spells to create massive tempo swings in the early game, as well as Kirin Tor Mage and Cabal Crystal Runner with secrets to create tempo swings in the mid-game. It then curves into some powerful late-game threats and burn spells. This deck can struggle against aggro decks because of how difficult it is to get value out of your secrets in those matchups, but its primary weakness is not drawing the right combinations of cards early enough. To improve this deck further, replace Mirror Images and Water Elementals with Medivh's Valets and Primordial Glyphs. The last deck I want to showcase is Inner Fire Priest. This is by far the most challenging of all the starter decks to play, but it's also a very good introduction to combo decks because of its ability to win games without needing the full combo. This deck aims to win through sticking a single minion to the board, buffing its health repeatedly, then combining double Divine Spirit and Inner Fire to kill the opponent in a single turn, but can also win by buffing a minion to mid-sized and then hitting with it repeatedly. Some important things to note are that you should try to draw multiple cards off of each Northshire Cleric and Acolyte Pain. Hold Master Spell for pushing past taunts when you're ready to go for lethal, and don't unstealth the buffed up Stranglethorn until you're ready to win or you're confident that your opponent has no removal in their deck. This deck crushes control and aggro, but can struggle against mid-range and tempo. If you want to spend dust to improve this deck, include 2 copies of Shadow Visions in place of 1 Shadow Word Pain and 1 Shadow Word Death to round out the consistency of the deck's combo potential. That does it for my 9 recommended starter decks. Let me know what your favorite starter deck is in the comments down below, and feel free to request a future video. Be sure to check out my last video, Deck Building 101, and if you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe. From one gamer to another, logging off.